What does it sound like to have permission to not focus on certain things in health and safety? What one concept are we missing from risk management that makes a massive difference? Hey, it's Andrew, and this is Safety on Tap. Since you're listening and you must be a leader wanting to grow yourself and drastically improve health and safety along the way, welcome to you. You're in the right place. If this is your first time listening, and thanks for joining us, and well done for trying something different to improve. And of course, welcome back to all of you wonderful regular listeners. My guest today is Tim Lee. Is he a safety professional? I ask him that, so you'll have to wait and see what he says. What I can tell you is that his roles have included group health, safety, and environment responsibilities, lifecycle alignment, culture, and capability. You don't often hear those things in people's jobs titles, do you? I met Tim a while back when I was invited along to a national health and safety team workshop. It took all of 2 minutes for me to be really curious about Tim. He's broadly read. He has both a practitioner and an academic background. He's an engineer who loves to solve problems, but is also hyper tuned into the messy complexity and people side of business. And he talks in a way that gives you a deep insight into how his brain works, which is fascinating. So that's why I wanted to introduce him to you. We had a wide-ranging chat. We dove deep on a few things, but still covered a fair bit of ground. I hope that you enjoy. Here's my chat with Tim Lee. Tim Lee, welcome to the Safety on Tap podcast.
Thanks, Andrew.
Do you consider yourself a health and safety professional? Is that a label that you use?
Oh, look, I don't like labels, but yes, I guess I definitely work in the industry. So,
but is that evading my question? Do you actually call yourself a safety professional?
I don't know. I mean, I don't like to at parties, if I'm honest. No, yes, I do. I try and help businesses make the best decisions that they can to prevent loss of life. So, that's my view of a safety professional. You know what I mean? Like, I don't have what I guess you'd say a conventional safety qualification and background. But yes, I guess I would consider myself a safety professional at the moment.
Interesting. I don't know whether this resonates with you, the idea about whether it's a proper noun or not. Like I say to people, and hopefully we'll get to talk about strategy later, that there's big S strategy and then there's little s strategy, which is being strategic and all of the things that are not fancy documents. And so I wonder, are you maybe just little s safety professional, not big S safety professional? Does that resonate?
I think so. I mean, safety is one of those interesting and often debated topics where, like, if I'm being kind of really honest, it's kind of there's just business in my view, you know, and we often hear safety is our, number one priority, and I kind of call a bit of BS on that. I actually just think we have objectives and you have a tolerance about how you achieve those objectives. So for me, safety is actually more about business than it is anything else. So it's probably a bit different of thinking about it that way, though.
That makes sense to me. So you mentioned that you've got a little bit of a different background. Tell us a bit about how you ended up where you are, whether you started at the beginning or whether you work your way backwards. What's the story?
Yeah, from birth, no. No, look, I never thought I'd do anything close to safety when I sort of left school. I mean, I studied chemical and biological engineering. I kind of knew what I wanted to do I thought I knew I wanted to do when I was 15. And I was poor. Like, I didn't have much all my mates worked full-time jobs, so they kind of had a lot of disposable income.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tried to cram whilst doing a sort of a dual degree. I also did like a trade role, sort of part-time, almost full-time. Like, I just tried to get as much money as possible as a sort of young student. And I got the grad role I wanted. I started working in a flour mill, sort of around more like process optimization, R&D, and realized I hated it a year out into kind of the real workforce, as they call it. And so, yeah, it was a bit daunting, but I kind of called up a professor of mine and she said, no, this is really normal. Come back, do some sort of research consulting work for some big mining companies. And that's that's kind of how I got into safety was, part of process or chemical engineering is you try and, learn how to stop refineries from blowing up, I guess. So you learn about HAZOP and all these other things. And then, yeah, so that was kind of my leg in. And then eventually I got tapped on the shoulder, a big retailer, so Woolworths needed some support with their sort of critical risk program. And yeah, that's how I sort of started into safety, as I didn't think I'd ever get into it.
Wow, there you go. So was it a good decision to go back into the uni research consulting space? Was that a sliding doors moment that was rewarding for you?
I loved it. I mean, I do like a bit of research. I liked, I mean, I'll be honest, when you ask like what I actually did, I actually read death reports. So I wouldn't say it was the most sort of interesting to most people, but
Yeah.
I found it fascinating, reading in-depth investigations of how people die in, sort of high hazard sort of settings. And yeah, it was just cool. We did some consulting for different, big tier mines, big global companies, etc., and got to sort of evaluate their risk management practices and programs. And so I think the beauty of research and kind of going through sort of big institutions like that is you get exposure to a vast range of different companies in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, absolutely. So apart from death reports, which obviously I appreciate the sensitivity of that, but also that from a intellectual research learning point of view, that would have been very, very interesting. How did this idea about critical risk come into play for you? Because process safety is not a new thing. It's been around for a very, very long time. So what's your take on critical risk more recently?
Look, I sort of, I can't remember if I picked it up or I was given it, but the ICMM, so the is it International Council of Mining and Minerals or something like that? ICMM was sort of, and the works of, I guess, Jim Joy were sort of my entry into critical risk. And I guess at the same time, I'd also, I guess, studied a bit of like Six Sigma. So like, more like operational excellence types of concepts. And label it what you want. Critical risk, like whatever they call. I think it is critical risk in ICMM actually, but it's it's largely all just the same stuff. It's probably just stemmed from the check review cycles back in whether the 50s or whenever it was. Six Sigma, I think back like Toyota and the likes of those kind of companies around process optimization, like all I saw that was different. Like, yes, they'd change the diagram and they'd add learnings and bits and pieces, but it was all kind of the same thing, but the objective was the main thing that changed. So whether your objective was quality or whether your objective was, reliable, kind of timely, cost efficient, like whatever it is, the objective for us is just people don't die.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, that was kind of my entry into it. I mean, today, I think it's all about context and business, like business context. You can't, I've never seen any framework, any bit of research, any beautiful model that you can just plug and play with.
Yeah.
It's not like, it's not like a commodity you can buy off the shelf and it works in your home.
Yeah.
It's all about context and how you adapt a theory to your business's needs.
That makes sense. So I'm curious, a lot of people will distinguish between process safety and occupational health and safety. What's your perspective on that? Like, is there a definitive difference? Are they unique and specialist in the sense that they earn different labels? Are they competing or ever in tension with each other? What's your perspective? Because I suppose you've kind of seen both.
Yeah, look, I think they're chalk and cheese. And I think the trouble that I've seen that safety has as a profession is it's like you get people like just say safety as this umbrella term.
Yeah.
Oh, we've got safety is our number one priority. Oh, we've got to be safe. And you have all these kind of campaigns and slogans and stuff around like, work safe and be safe, and even the regulator does it and stuff. And I think that's actually really bad because I don't know what the right solution is, because the right solution is you should take safety as an umbrella and unpack it into its relevant kind of subdomains.
Yep.
So, whether you call it occupational safety, process safety, or sort of critical risk and sort of occupational, like whatever the one is, or environment, like bucket it however you like, but just know that how you manage these things is drastically different. And I think the main thing I'd call out is where people die and where lots of people can die versus where a person can get personally harmed. There is a sort of distinct line, but let's just use an example. Okay. So first of all, I have used a grinder for many years, and they can kick, they can cut. They hurt sometimes, to be frank. I've got a few scars when I've used the grinder wrong. But if I have an injury from a grinder versus, let's say, like the structural integrity of an asset fails, first of all, the impact is vastly different.
Mm-hmm.
Investors and sort of big material impacts for a company, depending on the industry, like there is a few cases where personal injury from an accumulation sense would become material for the business.
Yeah.
But usually from an acute event perspective, one big failure from something that kills multiple people and hits the news can really do damage to companies. Like there are companies out there that have actually stopped trading because of the brand, whether it's the capital impacts, like all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So first of all, the impacts is extremely different. The materiality of the two, very, very different. But also, because of this materiality, the way that it needs to be managed is also very, very different.
Yep.
So depending on what your business does and depending on how it makes decisions, I guess the key difference is that the enterprise or the company, it's actually more about how it makes decisions and how it sets things up for success that will actually prevent that big material sort of, let's say it's structural failure, right? It's how it resources maintenance. It's what assets it actually buys and brings into its portfolio. It's big, due diligence sort of decisions. That's where it starts.
Yeah.
Whereas if I'm using a grinder, that's me. I'm the layer of defense, right? Maybe it's the quality of the grinder you procure, how well I'm trained in it, but it's all personal factors. Whereas the other one is big organizational factors that are the game. So I would definitely split them out. I think they're very, very different.
You picked up on an interesting word there that is coming up more and more in discussions I have with health and safety leaders in coaching in our community, but not a lot of people in health and safety actually understand what this word means. The word materiality, or what is material. So can you just talk us through a little bit about what you mean by that in the context of managing risk?
Yeah, so materiality is a great subject. So if let's say you're a business and there are many forms of sort of impact from an event. Now, this you could be a catering business, right? So the quality of your food, your sort of your food health and safety, your product safety sort of stuff, like so the impacts to your business on brand level, business continuity, cost, loss of life, like a classic sort of enterprise risk management framework, as they're called. The level of impact that managing a risk and when an event happens because the risk is managed poorly, that is what I mean by materiality, is how truly material getting something either wrong or if you do it well means to an overall business and its objectives.
Yep.
So materiality is interesting because it's also set by context. And what I mean by that is, let's say you are a construction company, you could be a tier 2 or something, Your business model relies on you winning, going for tenders, winning those tenders and then delivering effectively on that scope of works, right?
Yep.
So if that's your context, then it's actually interesting because the materiality of, say, occupational health and safety versus, like critical risk or major hazards or whatever the term you want to use is, you actually have to understand what it means from a business perspective. So let's say I am in a sort of tier 2 or tier 1 builder sense, because of the way the industry is now, people are actually evaluated on LTIs and TRIs, total recordable injuries and your lost time injuries, right?
Yep.
Now, because the industry is that way, and because sort of it hasn't really kind of, I don't know, there's not that many good metrics out there, I guess, around evaluating sort of occupational health and safety from, critical risk, or maybe there is, but the industry just hasn't caught on.
Yeah.
How well you manage occupational health and safety, or like your kind of higher frequency but lower impact incidents, it actually does become material to a business.
Yeah.
It's funny, right?
Yeah. Which is different from the actual risk. So I think that's
Correct.
the really interesting point here is that the commercial context is the thing that leads to its increased materiality. Is that,
Yes.
am I hearing you right?
100%. You cannot look at it purely from like, sure, there's loss of life versus multiple loss of life, like that obviously ramps up materiality, but a true sense of materiality should 100% look at the business context and the commercials.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought it's probably worth riffing a little bit on other or expressions of materiality. Maybe you and I can kind of take turns on this. Thinking about construction again in the Australian context, bidding for work that is funded by the federal government. One of the things they tried to do to drive better performance in the industry using their leverage, which is procurement leverage, is accreditation with the Office of the Federal Safety Commissioner. So FSC accreditation and all of the audits and systems and resourcing and clutter and bureaucracy and reporting and all that sort of stuff that goes along with it. It's really easy to go, oh, well, let's have a discussion about whether that does or doesn't add value. But nonetheless, it's still a material risk where it ties directly health and safety performance to the success of the business overall.
Yeah, no, I mean, accreditations for me are depending, look, it's all variable, but there was a good intent at one point, and then through deviations and stuff, like I'm sure maybe accreditations back when they first emerged were actually really, really great and really valuable. But over time, due to, different bias, different people sort of feeling like they needed to add more, or there was an incident or something, and then they felt they had to make a massive change from that incident. Like all of that stuff, as it accumulates over time, can it's kind of like Chinese whispers. You can take something from what it was originally supposed to be to look very, very different in present day. So I do feel for accreditation. I think they have their place, but they've probably become too, bureaucratic or
yeah. You got me thinking just then. Let's riff on this materiality a bit more. One of the discussions that's happening more and more with the people I'm working with is this idea about whether we are focusing on the right kind of value in the work that we do in health and safety. So what I mean by that is that our people kind of say often, well, we need to be better learning from incidents or from normal work or from what's going on in order to improve. That's an organizational learning frame. However, we've also got this tension or this expectation that if there is an incident, that there is one or more actions associated with that incident, which often leads to, okay, well, we've got to put something in because the system requires it as a default. So I kind of get this sense, and I hadn't actually thought about it until now. I get this sense actually maybe that we've got a distorted view of materiality in single incidents or injuries, not to take away from those individual people or circumstances, but that we actually react in a way to suggest that they are far more material than they actually are. And then maybe clutter comes from that distorted view of materiality. What do you think about that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would say think of materiality. So any risk, right? It comes down to acute versus accumulation,
Mm-hmm.
right? Something can be truly material when it happens once. That would be from an acute sense, big risks where, people or multiple people die, big implications. You're all over the media. Nobody wants to work with you. Your investors don't want to invest with you,
Yep.
your partners, et cetera, right? And then there's accumulation. And I think we sometimes mix up acute versus accumulation, and it's probably more of a heuristic thing. So when people are injured and you have personal experience seeing and actually dealing and managing with bad injuries, that can affect you, and that can be front of mind. And if it's front of mind and it affects you, it's going to come out in your natural sort of decision making. It's going to be a bias.
Yep.
So
Yep.
let's say a friend of yours has lost an arm using a chainsaw, right?
Yep.
That's pretty bad. But in terms of acute versus accumulation, how do you sort of reset and go, you know what? The subcontractor that managed the works, like they 100% need to be on top of this. They need to be implementing all the actions, etc. Versus you, who might have actually contracted the works and gone, well, do I need to actually go and invest lots and lots of monies in some, all these different forms of actions to try and systemically address ultimately what was, could have been, but it depends on the cause, right? But this is the trouble we get into. If things are so visible, visceral, and they're front of mind, they actually affect your clarity of, do I actually need to act on this? Do I, like, you would act on it, but how far do you go? How much is enough, I
And
guess?
what type of action? What part of the puzzle are we actually trying to work on here?
Exactly. If you don't know the cause, it would be, square peg, round hole, or whatever the analogy is. There's no point. Like, I think everybody, when they have these systems that prescribe action based on events, they just need to look at, if you have a cause and you know what that cause is, or you have multiple causal factors or something,
Yeah.
then your actions address those. But you also need to have you need to look at acute versus accumulation and go, how many of these things need to happen when action needs to be taken? Or is it just one? Like if you're not looking at acute versus accumulation in your system to determine action from event, I'd say you have a hole. You have a bit of a gap.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's useful too, because it brings up this idea about triggers. So I
Mm.
talk about this a lot, that one of the biggest problems with learning from incidents or when things go wrong versus learning from normal work is that the incident is the trigger. But when you talk about normal work, that's not enough to trigger learning, because if you want to learn about all of normal work, then that's too much. So you have to then choose what parts of normal work do you want to learn from. So then you need to have a trigger that's clear. So acute versus accumulation, and using that mindset is a really, really good way to be able to do that, I suspect.
I think so. I mean, it's easier said than done, especially when you've got lots of different stakeholders. Like you might have a general manager or a boss on your back basically saying, no, this isn't good enough. We must take action here. Like someone's fallen down the stairs and they've broken their wrist. We've got to roll out a stair safety program. It's like, well, no, you don't. But how do you, as a professional, have the skills in terms of influence instead of communication to actually, push back against those other opinions and stuff? It's very hard sometimes to push back against big voices.
100%. But I think it's also like, have we got the full conceptual picture? So one of the analogies I use, and I'll link to this episode that I did a reflection on in the show notes, is this idea that if you and I, Tim, want to plan a sailing trip around the world together, but if you think the Earth is round and I think the Earth is flat, we pull our maps out and then we try and plot a pathway. And we're never going to go on the same sailing trip, are we? Because
Right.
we don't see the world in the same way. So I appreciate that what you're highlighting for us is that people get the idea that we shouldn't overreact to every single incident. Contractors is a classic example where if we don't have a conceptualization of the extent of control, which is a commercial and a practical question, then we can't properly choose our response. But in the absence of that discussion about control, or the absence of discussion about materiality, then people go back to their default, which is someone is hurt and we should do something about it. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about. I'd love to hear some stories from you about how this has worked for you in practice when you've taken some of these ideas, thrown them against the wall, and what's stuck, what hasn't. What does that sound like when you're talking with the stakeholders you work with every day?
Oh, I mean, I look, bit of context. I've usually, I think, always held group roles, and I've always worked a large enterprise. So I'll say for anyone that's worked in sort of group versus sort of business unit or those types of enterprise arrangements, one of the sort of biggest learnings is you can't do people's jobs for them. So let's say, for example, there's an event and it's in a business unit. And let's say let's say it's a trip down some stairs, right? And let's say it's quite nasty. Let's say the person that fell down the stairs, needed some stitches, went to hospital, etc. So we're not talking little graze and bruise here. We're actually talking some decent personal injury. Well, I guess one of the challenges is when you see that from a one party removed sense, so from a group, and it happens in a business unit.
Yeah.
I guess what you try and do is you try and influence and you try and govern and sort of test sort of how well the response is or something like that. But really, if you might know the risk model, you might know, okay, the cause was due to this person wearing heels or whatever the case might be, right? And they want to go and like they're suggesting to have 5 different actions from this, going as high as, we need this coming from the top. We need a cultural initiative. We need, blah, 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 blah. You can't solve that for other people in a group role. You can influence and test and like ask questions, but as soon as you overstep and try and do the job for those other stakeholders, you failed. So I think that's been the biggest learning that I've had to kind of come to terms with over, like, I mean, I'm still young in my career, but I still to this day, I guess, have this bias around problem solving, fixing, etc., where I know the answer, it's clear as day, do this. But as soon as I overstep and I don't influence, coach, and try and lead them to understand why they wouldn't roll out a cultural initiative for someone that fell down some stairs wearing heels, I've failed. If I like, I mean? So that, I think, to me is, and it's very niche. Not many of us are in, I don't know how many people are in group roles. They have this specific dynamic that they always deal with. Like some people may just work in a normal business where they're in a support office or something like that. And in which case they just make the call.
Yeah.
But I think that's just a huge, like, I'm still coming to terms with it now. You like, it's not about solving it for other people.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think, I mean, as you're talking, whether you're in a group role or whether you're in we'll call it an operational safety role, still not your people, still not your site, still not your assets. So like,
Yes.
as you were talking, I was thinking about, Stephen Covey's circle of control, circle of influence, circle of concern. And as you were talking, I'm like, I don't think that's unique to group roles, Tim. I think that's health and safety professionals in general. Unless they say to you, you are the supervisor or you are in charge of production and you have the right decision authority, say, for example, to stop work or to direct work or whatnot. But otherwise, I think that question of overstepping the mark happens all the time for people.
So here's a curveball for you, because I'm going to go completely 180 on what I said.
Okay.
When the materiality of the event is such that it is truly material for the business. So I'm going to say, okay, that's example 1 with stair safety. Now let's use example 2, which is the structural integrity of an asset or a building. If you see, whether it's the operations, whether it's a contractor, whoever it is, like if you see essentially a gaping hole between cause and action, it does not matter about your circle of influence in the slightest. I do not believe it matters 1 cent, whether you're the PC, whether you're the support off. Like, I actually couldn't care less.
Yeah, yeah.
I will absolutely smash and intervene such that that thing happens. So it's a complete 180,
No,
like
no, no.
in terms of,
No, I think you're introducing context here, which is like, what
yeah.
you had said before. So let me ask you this then. How do you go about responding or taking control or being directive, whatever you want to call it? How do you go about doing that when, if you're, say, in a group role, you're talking about materiality and big stuff, where it's not a straight line? It's like if someone on a construction site is walking near an open penetration and there is a fall risk from that, it's like the physics and the facts of that situation are pretty clear. So we can say, get away, and it needs to be barricaded or whatever. But in your circumstance, in group roles and talking about bigger risk, I suspect that it's not always that cut and dried. So how do you bring that to life? How do you become the advocate for someone saying, no, 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 I am going to put my foot down here, and everyone's kind of going, who's this Tim bloke?
Yeah.
Do they get it? How do you go about helping them get it? Hey, it's Andrew with a quick reflection about performance. No one wakes up in the morning thinking, I wish I had a coach for work. So it's pretty normal that coaching isn't a concept that's on your mind. What I do know is, from working with hundreds of health and safety professionals, what's more likely to be in your mind are the frustrations you might be feeling about making change, or the doubts you have about your ability to step up, or concerns you have about the capability of your team to better service the needs of your organization. Or maybe you're excited but unsure about your new promotion, that expanded responsibility, or how in the heck you'll develop and deliver that new health and safety strategy. These are the everyday things in the game of health and safety practice. Some good, some not so good. A coach is not on the field of play with you. They don't pass you the ball and tell you what to do. A coach helps you be ready for the game, to prepare a plan, to develop the skills or the capabilities for the next challenge, and support you through the losses as well as the wins. Coaching is not evaluated on your participation or the time spent. Coaching is only evaluated on its outcomes for you, and they can be pretty awesome. Coaching is one of the most effective forms of professional development I've ever seen. I have a long list of stories and people who I can put you in touch with to tell you exactly how they've benefited from coaching with me. And it's a pretty smart investment in valuable resources for you and your team. If you want to explore how coaching might help accelerate you and your team's success, visit www.safetyontap.com/curious.
Well, I mean, look, it's all, again, with, you got to know your business. I mean, whenever you start a role, like, you probably can't put your foot down when you first start your role, right? You don't know how it works. You don't know who's who. You don't know who has social power, who has, formal power, etc. I think all you can do in that sense, if you do really see something, is you could escalate it to the right people that do have the sort of power and influence. So it really just depends on how your business works and sort of where you are. But I would say safety professionals, we're constantly at war, and we're waging a credibility war. It sounds dramatic, but it's so true, right?
Go on.
Every single person has to think about continuous credibility. And so let's say, you did see something that you think is truly material. And look, just to go back to the, fall penetration example, I have to say it, but that may not be, depending on if you work in a fund or something so removed from the operations, a full penetration of a contractor might not be your materiality threshold.
Oh, no, I
Even
agree. I
though,
was thinking about,
yeah.
you're the safety person walking the floor at the
Yes,
time.
yeah. Oh, that would
In
be
my
100%.
context,
Yeah. So anyway, so going back, I think we are always waging a credibility war, and sometimes when you do that, like, if you have been in the business for 5 years and you haven't been doing well on the credibility front, I think that's on you. And you might get really angry and get upset and say, oh my gosh, they're not doing what I want them to do. I've seen something truly material and they're not listening to me. Well, I'd say it's on you. Like, I don't know if that's a hard pill for people to swallow, but you need to reflect on, your own credibility. You need to look at Also what credibility have you, inherited? So you might have come into a job with the last safety person was hated or was, like
Just
not
ineffective.
respected, etc.
Yeah. Yep.
And so what you're going to, whether it's quite unfair, but you're going to inherit that baggage. And
Yeah.
so when you first enter, getting a good gauge of previous credibility, how do you build your own credibility? That's probably really important in the first 6 months to try and
Mhm.
establish that and do
Yep.
reparations.
Yep. Yep. No, that makes sense. So tell me, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of threads together and see if we can weave them. You had passed some comments before about the way you look at the world. That your default might be, I want to get in and I can see some solutions and I want to fix. And as you were talking in my brain, I went, that sounds like a lot of the conversations that I have with people who train as engineers or have worked as engineers.
Mm.
That it's a find and fix, diagnose and prescribe, like solve the problem kind of mindset.
Mm.
Now, I wonder what things have you struggled with or had to maybe unlearn and relearn from that way of looking at the world compared to the work that you do now?
Yeah. I mean, look, obviously there was that big one around it's not about how you solve the problem. I mean, I take a lot of it's a lot of parallels with relationships, really. Like if
Okay.
you, yeah, like your wife or your partner, like come home and they have a hard day or something, and you go, I'm gonna fix everything. Like that's not how it works.
Yeah.
If you haven't learned that yet, like, well, you've got a bit of bit of work to do. It's similar to that. So very early, I was very privileged to work with some great, great leaders, and they essentially just said, it's actually like it doesn't matter if you can solve a problem. Right? You might be the smartest cookie in the whole world, and you can solve, all these things. But what's more important is that you can essentially coach and steer and influence a group of very, very kind of diverse stakeholders to
Yeah.
solve something together. And
Yeah.
that's actually the main thing is I don't think anyone has to unlearn how to solve problems. I think how to solve problems, engineers are drilled this. They take something, they build it, they scope it, they write assumptions. There's a very methodical method
Mm-hmm.
to solving problems, and I think I'll come back to assumptions. Actually, it's a good there's something else there, but I guess to finish this point, I don't think anyone should unlearn that. I think the extra mile is they need to learn how to kind of embed and coach people through that without being super technical. Like
Yep.
so how do you solve problems like an engineer without without trying to sound like an engineer, without without sort of the people that you're trying to influence having possibly even a way of thinking that works so logically like that. I think that's the real trick.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think it for me it goes to I appreciate you said that maybe we don't need to unlearn, but we need to kind of learn new things. And for me, the find and fix or diagnose and prescribe or the engineer the solution kind of approach is perfectly fine when it meets certain criteria. So like when the situation is relatively well defined and the stakeholders largely agree and the facts are knowable or known, and like physics is a really good example of that, where like when it comes to putting stuff up and making sure it doesn't fall down or bend too far or explode under pressure, like
Yeah.
that stuff, like the physics is the physics. So that's great. Like do engineering, solve problems like that. The thing falling onto someone's head from a height, the hard hat and its engineering is like, let's engineer that thing. But then
Mm.
when we zoom out, because that's a fixed, it's almost like a finite game, to use kind of James
Yeah.
Carson's language. So you can solve the problem and then you go, the problem is solved. But then most of the time we need to zoom out and go, actually, this is an infinite game. So when you talk about building credibility, when you talk about making change with influence, when you talk about materiality, it's like there are no black and white answers. This is not a finite game to solve. The point is that we need to continue playing the game.
Mm.
And that's the inside out of an infinite game, which is how do we work out how to continue to play the game together?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on what you just. There's some very important And this is where I was wanting to go with that assumptions piece is
Mm.
how you solve problems that are sort of known versus unknown or ambiguous. Very, very different. And it's actually like, I kind of make it a parallel to risk matrix, right? So imagine you've got two axes, right? You've got on the right hand, on the vertical axis, you've got severity, right? So it could be, loss of life up the top or multiple loss of life down to sort of personal harm down the bottom. And then let's say you've got a horizontal axis, which is about how known the factors are. So,
Mm-hmm.
so on the left-hand side, close to the vertical axis,
Yep.
you've got known, you then move into ambiguous, and then you move into unknown. If you divided that up into sort of quadrants or sextants, if that's the word, you should actually know that like there are different methods for different quadrants or parts of that equation. So often we use a risk matrix, right? And we go, likelihood and consequence, that will work. And I'll put some colors on it and rate it to a one, cat 4, like it's just a freaking garden of cats, right? And so that only works, I would argue, when it is sort of moderate to low kind of severity and known. So
Yep.
it only works in that bottom left quadrant. The rest, different techniques. And it's a very similar thing with problem solving. When things are known, to your point, engineer that, like go it, find and fix. It works when it is low materiality, it is simple, and it is known.
Yep.
As soon as you start to move into other areas where things are ambiguous, you don't know, you're making assumptions, etc., you
Mm-hmm.
need to have a different method of problem solving.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, oh man, there's like about 6 or 7 past podcast episodes we can link back to here. Maslow's hammer is one of the ones that comes to mind, which is, for you've got a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And I think that kind of captures the essence of what you're saying there. There is so many different ways that we can go about doing this work better, not because anything is wrong, but because we pick the tool or the method that is most appropriate to the situation.
Hold on.
Conscious of the time, man, we haven't covered like heaps of the things that I wanted to talk to you about. So we might have to do a follow-up another time. So my question for you then, Tim, it may be in closing, is a magic wand kind of question. So what would you love to see change? Or what would you love the listeners who work in health and safety or are interested in the space to know that they might not know over and above what we've talked about already? What would you love to see change? What would you love?
Gosh. I wish it was a genie question, with the first wishes, I want more wishes. No. Look, I think there's lots of things that you could sort of dive into, but right now, I think this might help. I hope it helps people, but right now there's a big sort of wave of focus and sort of uncertainty about how to manage sort of psychosocial hazards.
Yep.
Which, don't get me started on that. Like I've got a, I'm not that interested in it, to be honest, but like I do think, like, I see the way that businesses are going about it and how they talk about it. But my magic wand would be, if there was a way that, and it's not a safety professional thing. I mean, if the safety professionals can enable this, that's fantastic. This is more of a business leadership wand. Is there a way that leaders can monitor capacity without micromanaging?
Mm-hmm.
That would be my magic wand. If leaders could find a very, fit for purpose and not, it's not simple, but a very kind of concise and clear way of monitoring teams' capacities without micromanaging, I think that will solve a lot of problems in the psychosocial space.
Amazing. So given we haven't talked about that concept of capacities, let's just do a quick definition from Tim's point of view. What do you mean by capacities? Why is that even relevant to focus on?
Capacity as in like how much time, brain power, a person, how much like kind of mental or physical resources a person has to allocate towards something. So
Okay.
let's say I manage 5 people, they have 40 hours a week. If they're working full time, for example, that would be a time capacity perspective, but they also have different skills and backgrounds and tools and resources allocation of all of those things towards different kind of jobs, tasks, activities, whatever. That's what I mean by capacity.
Yeah, I love it. And again, it's interesting. A lot of conversations recently. I don't know whether it's the end of the year because we're recording this just before Christmas or what, but it seems like a lot of people start to think about whether or not they should be getting out of their full-time job and doing something else. And I've been having, it's not the space I work in. I kind of refer people on to other people who can help them if they wanted to go out into the big bad world of business. But I kind of say to them, I think we've got to take a step back because the opportunity is to rethink the way we resource in the market. So, for example, I'm a lot more agile in my business to be able to go and get a lot of jobs done because I can go and find someone who can do a 4-hour job for me or a fixed small scope of piece of work. But right now in business, most of the time, the default approach is we need one body in one full-time role and they are permanent in that role. And then if we want to change what they do at any point in time, this is probably different from projects, but most of the time we just go, well, you figure it out. You've got to learn it, or you've got to thrash through it, or you've got to beg, borrow, steal, or you've got to do it badly. And I just think we can get a whole lot more flexible with the way that we resource, which I think in some sense is the other side of the equation of, looking at capacities is actually how do we get more flexible with the way that we deploy resources that we have.
Yes, we could talk about agile and the pros and cons and how that's kind of gone in business. So
another time, we'll put it down.
Another time.
I love it. Well, Tim, thank you so much for your sharing, your openness, and the flow of dialogue. This has been a really fun conversation, and thanks for joining us on the Safety on Tap podcast.
Thanks for having me.
How's that to leave us hanging on a question like that? It may disappoint some of you that there weren't a huge number of perfect answers or next steps from that conversation. I think that is actually kind of good because what I hope you heard is how we need to grapple with some of these challenges, that we need to think conceptually about what we do before rushing into action, and that there are no easy answers. You might say that this was more of a teaching to fish conversation rather than giving you the fish conversation. In fact, I had trouble picking just a few takeaways. I'll share a few of mine anyway in a moment, but would love to hear what you took away from this episode. You can join the conversation by leaving a comment for Tim and I. We will reply. You can do that over at safetyontap.com/EP217. Here's my 3 takeaways from that chat with Tim Lee. Takeaway number 1. It's not safety, it's business. In order to achieve what we set out to achieve as health and safety leaders, we need to talk less about that and more about business. That might sound paradoxical, but it's easier than you might think. You can start by falling out of love with your safety stuff and falling in love with the day-to-day operations. And you will see a whole lot more opportunity to improve health and safety outcomes than you could see before. Takeaway number 2. Discussion about risk needs discussion about materiality. The problem with risk assessment these days often is that everything is assessed to be important, so nothing is left out, and no one can differentiate what is genuinely more important. In roles like ours, talking about materiality, you can look it up, there's plenty of information out there, and helping our organization understand and dance with materiality decisions helps give us permission to double down on the most important stuff and gives us permission to leave the small things to the very competent people who can manage everyday work. This is the key that unlocks the shackles from being tied to first aid incidents and LTIs and fire extinguishers and trip hazards, and it directly connects us to mass casualty risks or collapse risks or the things that might shut down the business, which I think you'll agree definitely deserve more of our attention. Materiality needs to be a part of your work. And takeaway number 3. Tim said, we are constantly waging a credibility war. He said it like a punch in the face. How credible are you perceived to be by the people you seek to serve? Your opinion doesn't matter here. It's theirs that counts. Oh, and if you struggle with credibility, then maybe the earlier takeaways get us talking less about safety and more about business and getting just on the most important things, materiality. They're two great places to repair or improve your credibility. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, what's the one thing you'll do to take positive, effective, or rewarding action to grow yourself and drastically improve health and safety along the way? See ya.